here at the Tucson Festival of Books 2015, and we have a group of students from Mountain View High School, and they're interviewing the author Austin Aslan.
Hi, I'm Gia. Very nice to meet you. So I heard that you have lived in Hawaii for a few years. And then which part of Hawaii do you like the most?
Well, I lived on the Big Island of Hawaii in the town of Hilo, where I received my master's degree in tropical conservation biology at the University of Hawaii Hilo. And without a doubt, my favorite part of Hawaii is the Big Island. I think it has the most to offer. It's very diverse. It's a little bit more rustic and down to earth and less touristy than a lot of other parts of Hawaii. So it's easier to get a local, more culturally traditional experience while living there. And one of the things I love about Big Island is the volcanoes. It has active volcanoes. And Volcanoes National Park is such an incredible place. I've actually hiked out to active lava before, and I've been able to sort of touch it, not with my hands, but get right next to it and poke at it with some sticks, and it's just an incredible experience. At the same time, getting a master's degree there was amazing, because when we did class field trips, it was always to lava tubes or to canyons with jungly vines hanging down, or to lagoons, or scuba diving looking for fish. So it was just a really awesome, adventurous place to live.
So what's the experience in Hawaii that inspired you to write this book?
Well, I think this book is about a global disaster, but it's told from a very local perspective on the Hawaiian Islands. Everybody knows what happens in New York and Los Angeles when the end of the world comes. We've all seen that movie 10 times. But I wanted to ask the question, what would happen to the poor, forgotten people out there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean when everybody else has their own problems, and so they forget about the islands, and ships stop coming to port, and there's no more gas and there's no more food. And another concern that's different from here in Tucson perhaps is that there's nowhere to disperse to. If people can't go run off into the mountains and go hunting to get food. They're stuck on these islands, and there's 1.5 million people on these islands, and they have nowhere to go. So I was driving home from my field site at the top of Mauna Loa volcano one day, where I was researching rare Hawaiian plants, and I looked out and I saw the Pacific Ocean surrounding the island from this high vantage point. And I think this is an experience that a lot of islanders have sooner or later. They realize how isolated they are on this little patch of land out in the middle of absolutely nowhere. And I really felt the sense of isolation, and also the sense of interdependency that comes with it. The Hawaiian Islands are so dependent on the mainland for supplies. And it really got me thinking, what would happen if those supplies suddenly stopped coming and never came again? So that's sort of where the idea for this book came along. Also, I think I had just recently read Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which is not a young adult book, but it's an amazing, gripping, haunting, epic story about a father and his young son who are trying to survive after some unspoken cataclysmic global disaster. And so I was sort of channeling that when I originally was thinking about how to frame the story on the Hawaiian Islands. And as the father of a young daughter, I was interested in what lengths would I go to keep my daughter safe if something like this were to happen. And I needed to sort of start breaking rules in order to stay ahead of the game. And putting myself in that position really allowed me to think about all these different scenarios. And but I wanted to tell the story from the perspective of the daughter for a couple reasons. I wanted this to be a YA book, and I wanted to differentiate it from Cormac McCarthy's The Road as much as I could, and make it its own unique story. And I was just really interested in writing a strong female protagonist, a young adult female character who actually keeps her dad safe on this journey, sort of turning that old trope on its head, and had a lot of fun with it.
So, you as a man, is it very hard for you to write from a young lady perspective?
I've gotten that question often, and really, so the answer is that I guess I was just too ignorant to realize I shouldn't try to do that, and it just never really occurred to me that this was something that would be difficult. I channeled at the time my daughter was 6 years old, so I was projecting into the future what she would be like as a teenager. And I just did that thought experiment and started writing, and I found a voice. And I don't know. I might get myself into trouble saying this, but there's so much of the human experience that is shared between genders that I just didn't let it trouble me that I was writing as a guy from the perspective of a girl. And I was really pleased. I didn't even realize what I was doing at the time. I was just writing. But when the book was being shopped around and different editors in New York were looking at it, one of the most flattering comments I've ever gotten about the book was an editor at HarperCollins told me that she was surprised to learn that I was a guy after she had read the book, because she I guess there are some female Austins out there. Actually, I've met one. She worked at Home Depot. But anyway, she was really surprised that I was a guy, and she couldn't buy it at first. And that was the most flattering compliment I think I could have gotten. So apparently it worked, and I wish I had more insight specifically as to why. It wasn't really a craft issue for me where I pried open the box and used specific tools to try to do this. It just flowed naturally.
So last question for me. There are some like Hawaiian words and Hawaiian poem in the book. Do you yourself really enjoy Hawaiian language or something?
Well, I don't know Hawaiian, and it's actually a very intimidating language to try to understand and figure out. I do speak Spanish, so I am bilingual, but I didn't really attempt to learn Hawaiian per se. There is a lot of slang and local terms that you quickly begin to own as you live there because everyone speaks them. Words like keiki, which means kid, aloha, and then the shaka is the way you hold your hand when you're saying hi to somebody. Everyone there calls trash rubbish, which is a very British term. And so there's lots of local pidgin that's spoken, and it's sort of an amalgamation of all sorts of different slang and local speak from many different parts of the world. And you begin to pick it up and own it a little bit in that, you find yourself starting to use these words yourself throughout the day. So, there's a lot, but I never even learned how to really speak pidgin. There's a very thick pidgin that people can use that was always very enigmatic to me. I never got my mind wrapped around it. So my characters don't use that probably as authentically as they might if another author had tackled this project. But I did the best I could, and there was a conversation about whether or not the book should have a glossary in it of Hawaiian terms, and we decided in the end not to put it in there. For me, I didn't want that to distract from just being in the story. The book already has maps, which is great, but I didn't want it to become feel like a reference material. People going back and forth to the, from the story to the back of the book to look up words. I think these words mostly speak for themselves in the context of the story, and they can just be read and understood pretty easily. So that's my experience with the language as I went through this.
Okay, thank you very much.
So how did you come up with the disasters that Leilani faced? Where did you come up with those ideas?
Well, I had this original idea about ships stop coming to port, and what does that mean for Leilani and her father as they try to move from island to island back home. And in order to make that work, I had to come up with some catalyst for this, some event or trigger that made all this stuff happen. And I was considering lots of different avenues for that. Some of them have already been told in other stories. I was wondering about some disaster with the moon, but I know that Mary Beth Pfeffer has already done that, and some other ideas that just that seemed a little bit used already. So I wanted to try something a little bit more unique. And so I developed this electromagnetic aurora borealis-like thing that appears in the sky and starts to orbit the Earth. And it interrupts all electronics around the planet eventually. It takes a few days for everything to sort of transition from working to not working. And then the other neat thing about doing it that way is there's a visual representation to everybody on the planet that there's something wrong and it's not going away. And so that speeds up the process of society unfolding a little bit. A couple weeks ago, I live in Flagstaff, Arizona, and we lost internet for a day. There was an incident where a fiber optic cable was cut, and the entire northern half of the state of Arizona had no internet, no phone, no cable, no television, and it was a really odd, unique experience. And it was frustrating and an annoyance to be sure, and it might have led to some local emergencies with people not being able to communicate with each other. But for the most part, it was a novelty experience. People dealt with it just fine. They rolled with the punches, and we all sort of laughed about it, knowing that the power was going to go back on sometime later, maybe in the next few moments or next few hours. But imagine that scenario going on and on for days, and sort of starting to develop the sense that things aren't going to get better. And then imagine there's a giant thing in the night sky that's scary and alien looking and doesn't belong, and you sort of begin to appreciate how that affects people's psychology, and so things unravel in this book fairly quickly, and I think that's because everybody can sort of see the writing on the wall, figuratively, that things aren't going to get better. And then this is a very elemental subject for me in terms of writing and the craft of writing. I was once told by someone I really respect as a writer that plot is what gets in the way of what characters want. And I firmly integrated that into my psyche when I was writing this story. I love to say that because that way the book stays about the characters, and it doesn't turn into a book of events. It's about the character and how they're reacting to events. And the Hawaiian Islands themselves provided me with, each island has its own specific set of obstacles that get in the way of Leilani and her father as they try to go from Oahu to Molokai to Maui back to the Big Island. And I couldn't think of anything more grandiose to really embody the idea that these islands are getting in the way of what Leilani wants, which is to get home.
Is any of your characters based on anyone?
Great question. And yes, the father in this book is me, part and parcel for the most part. I mean, he has a different appearance, but I think he acts and reacts and thinks exactly the way I would. And to a certain extent, Leilani is my daughter, but I really had to imagine her as a half Hawaiian teenager, and at the time when I wrote the book, she was 6 years old, just a little, haole girl. So Leilani is not so much my daughter, but more an imaginative effort. But yes, Mike is who Mike is an ecologist. And a lot of his personality quirks are my personality quirks. And I think his relationship with his daughter is exactly the way I imagine my relationship with my daughter to be. Of course, when Ariel turns 16, she's going to be a full-blown teenager at that point, and I have no idea how we're going to get along. So we'll just have to see how that unfolds. But it was easy for me to sort of take my 6-year-old daughter and grow her up a little bit.
What is your daily routine, like writing routine?
Oh, my writing routine? I don't really have one. I don't really subscribe to the idea that you have to fix into some sort of routine in order to get in the groove of writing. For better or for worse, I don't have a specific set of patterns that I follow. For me, I do have to get momentum building, so I need a lot of space and time to sort of get in the creative zone and to write. It's hard for me to write episodically where I'm just like putting down a paragraph at a time and then going to do dishes or something. I do like to get in this quiet space for a long period of time, and then I start to write. And I probably shouldn't admit this, but if to the extent that I do have a pattern, it's a pretty bad one. When I'm really in the writing zone, I find myself completely nocturnal. I stay up all night drinking Coca-Cola and eating Cheetos. And then I go to bed at 5 in the morning and I wake up at noon. So maybe that's a pattern, but that's not always the case. It's just when I really get in the zone, that's sort of what ends up happening. And unfortunately, I think my keyboard is orange because of all the Cheeto cheese powder that ends up getting on the keys. TMI.
What were your goals and intentions in this book, and how did you achieve it?
Yeah, great question. So, immediately when I conceived the idea of this story, I thought about it in an ecological context. Because this idea came to me and the urgency of this story really revealed itself to me to be about interdependency and as a cautionary tale about the sustainability of the Hawaiian Islands. My understanding is that at its peak, the Hawaiian Islands, before European contact, was a nation of all these connected islands, and there was around 150,000 people throughout the islands. And, by definition, they were living a pretty sustainable existence. They didn't have contact with the outside, and they grew their own food, and they fished their own waters sustainably, and they had lots of different practices that made things work. Fast forward 200 years, and now the Hawaiian Islands have 1.5 million people on them. And there's no way that the islands could suddenly be cut off and the people could feed themselves and grow their own food and supply their own water and provide for their own sanitation. So that was very much at the forefront of my thinking about this book, and I wanted it to be a cautionary tale. Ultimately, ideally, I would love this book to create conversations in Hawaii and to be a sort of maybe not a centerpiece, but a showpiece, a conversation point in the halls of power in Hawaii among legislators and governor's office and other local entities where a lot more work can be done on the local level to say we need to make sure that we have a sustainability plan and that we can be cut off from the rest of the world for a certain amount of time without complete disaster unfolding. So yeah, there are those larger elements. I try not to let the story get lost in pontificating and lessons, and so I wanted it to be a compelling, fast-paced adventure story at the same time, and let all those other themes sort of unfold on their own and speak for themselves.
In the book, there was discrimination by the native Hawaiians against outsiders. Did you have to deal with this while living in Hawaii?
Okay, so yeah, and this can be a touchy subject. I think that all experiences are in play in Hawaii. So being an outsider, a mainlander, a white haole, coming in and being a visitor on the Hawaiian Islands, I was very sensitive to the idea of telling a story in which it was the, tourists that are being persecuted by islanders. That's certainly not my belief. I do think that tourists would become easy early targets for islanders in the event that everybody is suddenly starting to fend for themselves. And I do believe that there's a tendency within us to sort of revert to our tribal nature and to connect closely to those we know. That's one of the benefits of having the society that we have, and one of the perils of losing the society that we have is that we lose those broader ties that bind us together, and we sort of revert to earlier ways for good and for bad. My story has a lot of Hawaiian heroes, as well as having Hawaiian villains, and I think that's just being fair. I didn't want to engage in tokenism, trying to paint any race or any group as one thing and another group as another. My view of the world is that the world is a very complex place, and that you can find many different perspectives. So, yeah, it was interesting writing about that. And I was sensitive to it, especially being a white male, writing the story and trying to imagine what things would unfold. But I think there's good in everybody and bad in that there's bad in a lot of people, and that crosses racial lines. That has nothing to do with race or religion or creed or orientation or gender or anything. So I tried to make this a very complex world. And I believe so far the book has been received very openly, and there hasn't been a lot of questions or critique around that issue specifically. And I think it's because maybe I succeeded in just making the world here complex and not trying to oversimplify things. And I'm certainly not trying to tell a story with those themes as thematic elements or issues. I'm just story of. This whole book is a thought experiment. What would actually happen to people if this situation started to unfold? And I tried to be as true to that as I could be.
Did you have to do a lot of research already?
There are a couple ways in which I did do a lot of research. I wasn't primarily focused when I was writing this book on getting things right. Again, I didn't know this book was going to get published. This was just a hobby, a writing project for me, so I was sitting down and writing forward. But there were things I looked up, and Hawaiian mythology, a lot of Hawaiian words and a lot of Hawaiian ways are things that I did study a little bit. Hawaiian history was something that I didn't come with naturally, so I had to go back and look for stories and mythologies, and I visited many museums while I lived in Hawaii. The Bishop Museum on Oahu. There's the Imaloa Astronomy Center on the Big Island of Hawaii. I spent many, many hours in those halls reading all the stuff that most people just sort of pass by and glance at on their way to some major thing to look at. And so, yeah, there was a lot of research that went into this. And there's also an element in the story that involves nuclear meltdowns. And I'm not a nuclear physicist, so I don't know a lot about that. I didn't concern myself too largely with getting the details right in terms of how the physics of that works. Specifically, so meltdowns occur when nuclear materials overheat, and the idea is that they overheat in this scenario because water can no longer be pumped into these coolant systems because the power's off. And I'm aware that there are some nuclear power plants around the world that have some nice fail-safes to sort of combat these scenarios. What I wasn't too concerned with in the story was that level of detail. Again, I wanted this to be a cautionary tale, and so I think it's plausible to just consider the story in terms of the overall danger and risk that without power, we let the genie out of the bottle, so to speak. In the sequel, there's a guy who thinks to himself, "We built a ticking time bomb and forgot that it had a timer." And so that's the point. As an author telling an adventure story, I don't need to dive into the research of nuclear particle physics and how the engineering behind nuclear reactors. I just want to tell my story.
So in the story, you decide to make epilepsy like one of the most key things to saving the world. I'm just curious why.
Well, okay, so epilepsy started, again, as a simple puzzle-solving tool for the story design elements. I needed a reason for Leilani and her father to be on the wrong island when these events happened during the school year. And so I knew that she was probably dealing with some sort of disorder for which she was getting treatment. Big Island does not have a lot of those resources, and it's very common for people with medical conditions to avoid the Big Island entirely or to have to travel to Oahu on a regular basis. So I started there, and I ended up going with epilepsy because it's an ailment that I'm familiar with a little bit. I have family members that have battled with epilepsy and with seizures and with the confusions and frustrations and anxieties around figuring out the right medication levels and how you have to bounce back and forth on those to calibrate them the right way because there's always weird side effects. And also, we're dealing with a global blackout here, which is a worldwide electronics failure. And I saw a lot of opportunity in the connection between the way Leilani's brain works and the way the world has stopped working. And I thought there was a lot of fertile ground there to explore. So those are the reasons why epilepsy was chosen as the thing that Leilani was dealing with. At the same time, I was very cognizant not to make this story about epilepsy or about Leilani being an epileptic. Epilepsy was a part of who Leilani is, but it's not what defines her.
This is outside the book, but I was just curious, what was the first ever book you wrote? Was it this one or was it a different one?
This was my 6th novel that I completed.
Oh, nice.
So I had my 6th nice bottle of wine after finishing this one up. It's the first book I've been able to publish. And the other 5 books, I don't begrudge that experience in writing them because I spent 10 years doing that and becoming a much better writer in the process. That's how I cut my teeth, and that's how I practiced. I'm not someone I haven't taken writing classes, and I didn't get a writing degree. And so this was definitely a hobby on the side. Publication was always a goal of mine. It's something that I dearly desired and dreamed about a lot. And I tried to get some of the other manuscripts published to no avail. And it's interesting because when I started writing this, there was a lot of things I'd learned along the way that I knew to implement from the start. So I didn't have to go back and correct certain mistakes, like, for example, how to open a story or certain other elements of, how to create characters and how to create tension. I was able to start with a blank page and do that correctly because I had learned through this entire process what works and what doesn't work for me. I could almost tell as I was writing this book that something felt new and different here, and that I'd finally crossed a threshold in my writing and in my storytelling and in my weaving a tale together that really excited me because it felt like things were clicking into place in a new way. And my test readers were saying the same thing. Like, Austin, you're writing a book that feels like a book, which was nice feedback to finally be getting after 10 years of trying. And I guess that would lead me to just point out that persistence is so important in the craft of writing, and to never give up. I'm a guy who was not a good writer, who had a deep, dark dream to become published, and I kept trying and trying and trying, and it was a very painful experience at times. But if I can be an example out there to others that, even I could do it, then anybody can. I think that's very true. It just takes persistence. And I'm not a very persistent person. There's a lot of ways in my life in which I don't feel motivated, and in which I don't follow through, and in which I drag my feet. But writing has always been this thread for me throughout everything and all my various changing careers and all my various changing attitudes that I've held on to. And I'm glad I did, because there's lots of moments in a writer's life, and in mine in particular, in which I felt like giving up and just doing something else, letting writing go because it wasn't working out. But that was the one place in my life where I was very persistent and motivated and had this sort of dogged, undying optimism that drove me forward. And it's a testament to the fact that things can work out after a long time of not working out if you just keep at it and keep at it and keep at it.
I feel motivated now.
Awesome.
Well, thank you. This is really great. I'm glad.
Thank you. This is a really cool experience. I don't know if you've described the scene here, but we're in this little tent filled with carpeting or, rugs that you use in moving vans.
It's a wee little thing.
And I almost feel like I came in here to get my palm read because we're around this circular table with blue felt, and I'm surrounded by awesome young adults, and it's just everyone's looking at me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank you all very much. This was very fun.